I want to begin with the first two stanzas of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three. By thy long grey beard and thy glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me? He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years' child. The mariner hath his will. I love the illustrations here by Gustave Doré. You can just see the crazed look in the man's eyes as he stopped this wedding guest. These opening stanzas to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner are some of the most arresting passages in the whole volume. The wedding guest is stopped, and what he hears changes him forever. And I want to draw your attention to this moment because this is emblematic of what will happen to us and what happens over and over again in all of these poems that we're reading over over these 2 weeks. Moments of interruption, of stillness, are significant throughout the lyrical ballads. They're going to be important for you to focus on for our theme of enchantment, because this is where the magic happens. Whether it's the mariner's stopping of the wedding guest, which we have here, whether it's Wordsworth's speaker stopping the cottage girl to ask about her family, whether it's the stillness of Lucy in her diurnal sleep, or the stopping of an old man on the way to see his dying son, or the stopping of a poor shepherd who's crying, holding his last lamb, or the suspension of the human blood as the mind feels the sublime power in Tintern Abbey. These moments of stillness are what enable the spiritual transformation. How the lyrical ballads work a change upon its readers, upon us, is an overarching theme of these two lectures. The lyrical ballads is a collection of poems jointly published by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's one of the most important collections of poetry in the history of English literature. I'm not just saying that because I love Wordsworth. If you write poetry today, you are influenced by this volume, whether or not you have ever read it, whether or not you even know of its existence. And you may be surprised by that and think, okay, well, that's just exaggeration. It's just exuberance. But these poems, they're deceptively simple. This little book of poems about birds, flowers, breezes. It'll be surprising for you to learn is one of the most significant interventions to come into print at the turn of the 19th century. It was a political intervention, a social intervention, an intellectual intervention, and a spiritual intervention, just as much as it was a literary one. Because the lyrical ballads is a long answer to a question. How can human beings live truly free? That's what the lyrical ballads seek to answer. This collection arrived at a time of crisis in the world of letters and society, and it reminded readers of the sanctity of the human mind and the sacred interdependence between ourselves and the natural world. It taught them, and it teaches us, how true liberty might be found. It introduced a new voice of sincerity to the history of poetry, and it addressed and continues to address the ecological crisis of our own era. And it does all of this through lyric poetry. Now, it's remarkable how this collection came to be. The volume begins with a friendship between three people, really. Not just William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but also Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy Wordsworth. William and Dorothy crossed paths with Samuel in 1696, sometime around there. And what followed was an intense year of poetic production. Coleridge's restless and indomitable philosophical energy combined with Wordsworth's visionary and emotional sensitivity made the two of them positively alchemical. The first edition of the Lyrical Ballads was actually published in 1798 with a modest print run of 500 copies. They sold pretty well. Wordsworth then expanded the second edition in 1800, adding a new preface that would become one of the most influential critical essays on poetry. And this edition included 37 additional poems by Wordsworth. A subsequent edition was published in 1802, with each version offering slightly revised poems and expansions, particularly to Wordsworth's preface. He adds a whole section on the poet in 1802. So what we're reading is really the 1802 two-volume version published. It was basically the third edition at that time. Most of these poems you've read, or are reading, were written by Wordsworth. The preface was entirely by Wordsworth. But the two, Coleridge and Wordsworth, were equally essential for the production of this volume. Without Coleridge, there would be no Wordsworth we know today. And without Wordsworth, history would have given us a very different Coleridge. And here is Coleridge on the screen. This is Coleridge in 1795, painted by Peter Van Dyck. His long flowing locks were quite the fashion in the late 1790s, after the hair powder tax was introduced by William Pitt in 1795. But you can see Coleridge is ahead of his time here. He's already ahead of the trend. With long hair like that, he'd clearly been growing it out before the tax. So gone were the powdered wigs of the Georgian era, of the long Georgian era. And after 100 years, the Cavalier style is back in, though this would have looked similar to what men would have worn in Milton's day. In fact, Coleridge is probably thinking a little bit of Milton here with the long hair. It was a social statement. The natural locks bespoke of a persuasion similar to that communicated now by ripped jeans, or at least in the late 20th century, ripped jeans was a anti-establishment sentiment. But look how the artist captured his eyes, and this is something that's striking about the descriptions we get of Coleridge here. This is glowing almost with a visionary gleam, half looking out upon the material world, half in the world of thought, perceptively keen and bright, full of vigor. Notice the mouth, lips parted, which is interesting. It's just as if he were about to speak. Poor Coleridge was actually a mouth breather, so he couldn't breathe through his nose. But this is likely how you would have seen Coleridge. And in fact, had this been a photograph, his lips would have been a blur because he was constantly talking. Charles Lamb notes a funny incident in which they were walking to, I believe it was Evensong, and Coleridge was rhapsodizing with his hand up, and they're almost to the church, and Coleridge grabs Charles Lamb by the button of his shirt and pulls him into the garden, and he stands there and begins philosophizing with his eyes closed, holding Charles Lamb by the button, and Lamb, wanting to get off to church in time, takes a penknife out and cuts himself free by the button and goes into service. And legend has it, when Lamb walked out, Coleridge was still in the garden, rhapsodizing, holding on to the button just as Charles Lamb left him. Who knows if that's true? It seems to communicate something very true and very consistent about everyone who met Coleridge. He was always talking. In fact, William Hazlitt, who was a friend of this group at the time, has this incredible description of Coleridge. His genius at that time had angelic wings and fed on manna. He talked on forever, and you wished him to talk on forever. His thoughts did not seem to come with labor and effort, but as if borne on the gusts of genius, and as if the wings of his imagination lifted him from off his feet. His voice rolled on the ear like the pealing organ, and its sound alone was the music of thought. His mind was clothed with wings, and raised on them, he lifted philosophy to heaven. In his descriptions, you saw the progress of human happiness and liberty in bright and never-ending succession, like the steps of Jacob's ladder. Notice the key here. Happiness and liberty. This is a key theme for Coleridge. with airy shapes ascending and descending, and with the voice of God at the top of the ladder. Doesn't get any more extravagant than that. And possibly true, because this is consistent with almost everyone else. Here's a picture of Wordsworth, a drawing from around this time, 1798, when the two would have been working together. He's admirably pulling off what was called the Titus cut. And before this meeting started, we were chatting about the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. If you've seen that, then you've seen the Titus cut, because Darcy is sporting a very neat Titus cut in that movie, a hairstyle popular with men at the end of the 18th century in both France and England. Wordsworth had spent some time in France during the Revolution. We'll talk about that. So the haircut might speak to a continental interest here. His cravat is, as you can see, much more modest than Coleridge's. But here he is. He's got this regal brow and Roman nose that was so characteristic of Wordsworth. His gentle eyes peering out from beneath those languid lids, bespeaking the meditative vision and tranquility that would become so characteristic of his best verse. His eye looks like one which you read about in Tintern Abbey, that while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. Together, these two, along with Dorothy, spent their time talking philosophy, drinking tea, the Wordsworth's only extravagance, going for walks, writing poetry, and staying up into the wee hours of the morning. Not a bad way to spend a summer. In the following year, in 1798, most of the poems were written on long walks on the cantocks or in the garden. And if you were to tag along with them on these walks, what might you have heard? Coleridge would be talking about Spinoza, we know that. Wordsworth and Coleridge both would have been talking about nature. And I think Wordsworth's poem, Lines Written in Early Spring, which was composed by Wordsworth beside a brook in the grounds of Alfoxden, give us a pretty good picture of what they were talking about. And Brian, I noticed that you mentioned this in the discussion online. Beautiful poem. I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined, in that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. Through primrose tufts, in that green bower, periwinkle trailed its wreaths, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. The birds around me hopped and played, their thoughts I cannot measure, but the least emotion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure. The budding twigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air, and I must think, do all I can, that there was pleasure there. If I these thoughts may not prevent, if such be of my creed the plan, have I not reason to lament what man has made of man? You'll notice one of the things that comes up in this poem quite a bit is pleasure. The word occurs twice, and the variant in pleasant makes the third. And it's all about nature enjoying nature. So in a word, if you were to accompany them on one of these walks, you would have been speaking of nature. For the Romantics, there was an I-thou relationship with nature. Someone closer to our own day, Martin Buber, talks about the I-thou relationship between humans. Levinas talks about the face. For the Romantics, they had this relationship with nature. Nature was basically everything. And notice the coalescence described in the sensorial enjoyment of nature and the state of mind. Nature's works are linked to the human soul. And that's a fairly important metaphor, linking or binding. And there's this pattern occurring in Wordsworth's poetry here. But there's this discordance too between the way the fair works live and the way that the humans live, the human beings live. Man has made man something other than what nature would make man and what nature makes everything else. Nature, for Wordsworth and Coleridge, there's a threefold understanding here. It's the external world, yes, that's the first sense, and that's usually what we think of when we think of nature, the natural parks and going out into nature. There's also the sense that everything is nature. Thought is nature. Thought participates in the activity of nature, and so the second sense would be the human mind is also nature. And the third sense would be this spiritual motion, a motion in a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. It's this vast network of things, of human things, of anything that exists, and anything of the spirit. So there's that threefold understanding. So when you come across the word nature in one of their poems, have that in mind. It's not just the external world. So these were the sorts of things that Wordsworth and Coleridge talked about and got excited by. These are the kinds of conversations they shared as they rested by streams and walked over the cantocks. They saw into the life of things, and they wanted others to see into it as well. That the human mind was a part of such life, was capable of such enjoyment, and ought to be nourished by it. And although the two friends would eventually drift apart, this was the essential truth that held both their lives together, their shared mission. Now, the lyrical ballads I mentioned was not just an intellectual intervention, it was also a political intervention. It was all in the answer to the question, how can human beings truly live freely? And this leads us to the political intervention of the book itself. The poems make this. Now, Napoleon once said that to understand a man, one has to know what was happening in the world when he was 20. And although I don't care much for Napoleon, I think what he says is true here. In many ways, the political events and social challenges that you all will face or have faced in your 20s will contribute to your own formation and intellectual thought. It's going to shape how you decide to use your gifts to bring about a better future and how you operate in the world to some degree. And in 1789, when Coleridge and Wordsworth were undergraduates, or in their late teens. Coleridge was 17 then. Wordsworth was 19, an undergraduate at St. John's College, Cambridge. The French Revolution happened. And the French Revolution was probably the most important event that happened in the Western world at the turn of the century. It has its causes deeply in France's social, economic, and political crises. To some extent, England never had the revolution because I think they had the civil wars in the 17th century, which introduced a stronger parliamentary government. But in France, it was largely ruled completely by the monarchy, King Louis XVI. His monarchy was facing financial problems exacerbated by his involvement in the wars like the American Revolutionary War and his lavish court expenses. Socially, France was deeply in debt and deeply divided. It still had a pretty rigid feudal system in which the nobility and the clergy enjoyed social privileges that the majority of people just did not have, including the peasants and including the emerging bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie. They shouldered heavy taxes. So the revolution began with the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, an event that symbolized the people's revolt against the king's tyranny. And this marked the revolution's initial phase, characterized by the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. It was a bright moment in the future, in the present, rather. The future was looking bright, I should say. Everyone was very eager, at least the young people were. The king surrendered to the people. A national assembly was set up to dismantle the feudal privileges of the aristocracy, and it was the beginnings of establishing a constitutional monarchy, just like England had. That is, a monarchy that was jointly governed by elected officials as well as the king or queen. So for many people in England, this was a tremendously hopeful event. Many in England thought that this was an act of freedom that would usher in the 10,000 reign of Christ. This was what was called uh, this apocalyptic expectation of the imminent arrival of Christ, of the divine kingdom on earth, the kingdom of peace. People were still looking for it, religious, whether you were a dissenter or of the Church of England. So it was rooted in this religious expectation for religious people in England, which is to say, all English people, at a transformative time. In England, there's merged with this political radicalism, seeing the revolutionary events as harbingers of a new and just era. It's kind of hard to imagine like an event like that as signifying something so supernatural. But it was. A dissenting minister, Richard Price, wrote a sermon in which he talks about the French Revolution. This is what it meant for him, and this is what it meant for many at this time. What an eventful period is this! I am thankful that I have lived to it, and I could almost say, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. He's quoting the words of Simeon in the Gospel of Luke when the old man Simeon lives to see the baby Christ going in for circumcision. Mine eyes have seen thy salvation. I have lived to see a diffusion of knowledge which has undermined superstition and error. I have lived to see the rights of men better understood than ever, and nations panting for liberty which seemed to have lost the idea of it. I have lived to see 30 millions of people, indignant and resolute, spurning at slavery and demanding liberty with an irresistible voice, their king led in triumph, and an arbitrary monarch surrendering himself to his subjects. And now methinks, very prophetic word, he's looking into the future, and now methinks I see the ardor for liberty catching and spreading, a general amendment beginning in human affairs, the dominion of kings changed for the dominion of laws, and the dominion of priests giving way to the dominion of reason and conscience. The revolutionary millenarianism, while drawing deeply from this deep religious tradition, fits into the broader Enlightenment thought in England, where political and social reforms linked religious salvation with political revolution. Coleridge and Wordsworth were caught up in the enthusiasm, in the optimism, and hoped, with many, for the spirit of change. When I was an undergraduate, it was Bernie Sanders. When the Romantics were undergraduates, it was the French Revolution. During his, I mean, Wordsworth especially had remarkable freedom in pursuing this interest. During his summer vacation, Wordsworth actually traveled to France, partly by the help of Charlotte Smith, by the way, who provided him letters of introduction. And he saw the revolution firsthand. And he visited the Bastille, and when he did, he pocketed a stone from the ruins, the way tourists in Germany would take a piece of the Berlin Wall in the late 20th century. So this really represented the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. It's really hard to imagine how exciting it was for them. And eventually, how utterly disappointing the events that transpired were. Because as the revolution grew more violent, especially during the Reign of Terror, the initial idealism and the hopefulness that many English writers had, including Wordsworth and Coleridge, waned. This disillusionment evolved from revolutionary enthusiasm to a more introspective and critical assessment. They're watching what's happening, and the revolution's turning into chaos, and disappointment quickly turns into the ruin of despair, especially for Wordsworth. This was the long hoped for light upon which their souls had eagerly gazed for so long, um, slowly snuffed out. And Wordsworth witnessed firsthand the bloodshed of the September massacres. He was in Paris when that happened and probably saw the guillotine claim so many lives, so many innocent lives, really. So, and he's lucky, by the way, to escape with his own life. He had nightmares about this. He writes in the Prelude how even after he returned safely to England, he was imagining defending his life before in a dummy trial with his broken French, and it was just very anxious. He was very anxious about it, but he escaped with his life and returned to England in despair. And it was in this despair where the two poets who met each other shortly after and during this period of despair, when they began to realize that liberty and freedom were not to be gained by external revolutionary political force alone, but in accompaniment with a spiritual and moral change of individuals. So, how do people become truly free? How might the literary arts, how might poetry become more accessible to people beyond the educated privilege? And how might the language of poetry really speak the language of its readers, the common human being, the everyday person, and speak about the common world they inhabit? And how can it do this with dignity? And that's what the Lyrical Ballads is all about. So the two poets began their poetic revolution to free the minds of readers in two ways. And the first was to write in a language used by real people. This is what's called diction, word choice. Wordsworth says in his 1802 preface, "There will also be found in these volumes little of what is usually called poetic diction. I have taken as much pains to avoid it as others ordinarily take to produce it. This I have done for the reason already alleged, to bring my language nearer to the language of men. And further, because the pleasure which I have proposed," there's that word again. So one of the ways that these poems changed poetry is by using a new kind of diction or word choice. Let me give you an example of what poetry was like before Wordsworth, in Wordsworth's own time. This is from Edward Young's Night Thoughts, and I've used it before on this channel. This was published in 1745. Listen to Edward Young's description of the night, and you'll get a good sense of what poetic diction should be like in the 18th century. "Are there demurring wits who dare dispute this revolution of the world inspired? Ye train Pierian to the lunar sphere, in silent hour address your ardent call for aid immortal, lest her brothers write. She with the spheres harmonious nightly leads a mazy dance, and hears their matchless strain, a strain for gods denied to mortal ear. It's beautiful, it's proper, it's highfalutin." And that's what the diction, that's the kind of diction that Wordsworth wants to avoid. Young here is describing what was described by Pythagoras as the music of the spheres. Because the distance of the planets, it was believed, corresponded to the musical intervals, the result of their motion must be music, hence this harmony, the music of the sphere. And Pythagoras wondered why mortals couldn't hear it, which is why Young here mentions here that it's a matchless strain for gods denied to mortal ears. Only the gods can hear it. But notice how Edward Young avoids many English root words. Instead of the moon, he says lunar sphere. It's Latinate. Instead of stars, he says the sphere's harmonious. And these Latinate polysyllabic words give the lines a liquid grace. Yes, the sounds rise and fall over the moany vowels and extend the length of words in ornate description. But the syntax, too, is complicated by several parentheticals, which delay the main verbs. This is not how people speak in conversation. The point is, it's not the kind of language one speaks when one's talking to one's friends. Wordsworth and Coleridge wanted to do away with that. And so this is what Wordsworth in the preface calls the gaudiness and inane phraseology. He used Thomas Gray as the punching bag here, but Edward Young works just as well here for a demonstration. Here's Coleridge's description of the evening in his The Nightingale. Come, we will rest upon this old mossy bridge. You see the glimmer of the stream beneath, but hear no murmuring. It flows silently o'er its soft bed of verdure. All is still, a balmy night, and though the stars be dim, yet let us think upon the vernal showers that gladden the green earth, and we shall find a pleasure in the dimness of the stars. It's that word, pleasure, again. But notice how conversational it is. The word order is that of ordinary speech. The diction itself is that of the real language of nature, the real language of men. There are some Latinate words here. Verdure, which means green, but it was a common word. Coleridge called these longer poems, like The Nightingale, like Tintern Abbey, and like his Frost at Midnight, if you've read that, he called them conversation poems, which highlights the conversational style. They wanted their poetry to speak the language of everyday life, stripped of pretension, but no less earnest in its zeal. A second way they wanted to perform this poetic revolution was through imagery. It wasn't just word choice. Connected with diction is the subject matter, where you get your imagery from. Now, today, most people expect a poem to be full of flowers and trees and breezes. We look at this today and we're not shocked at all. But before the Romantic period, poetry was reserved for the most austere and revered subjects. Robert Graves calls this the Apollonian tradition or the classical tradition. John Milton chose to sing of heaven in narrative verse. The highest subjects were reserved for this medium. But to take a daffodil as the subject of a poem and speak of it with the same grandeur and dignity with which Milton had invested the throne room of God himself was something unexpected. Wordsworth writes in his preface, "The principal object, then, his goal, which I proposed to myself in these poems, was to choose incidents and situations from common life, and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men. Low and rustic life was generally chosen, because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language." Plainer equals more emphatic. It's more emphatic because it's plainer. And Robert Blair, in his lectures on Belles-Lettres, is a forerunner of this. The sublime is plain. It's more passionate. So this collection emphasizes the use of everyday imagery, of language, focusing on incidents from common life. This transformed the imagination to reveal deeper truths about human nature. The work revolutionized poetry by breaking from these classical and neoclassical traditions. The poems often take poor subjects, poor people as subjects, which is rather that you would take a poor man and consider him a worthy subject for not only tragedy, but a deep source of pathos. And that's what he does in The Last of the Flock. I just want to read you these two stanzas here. I'll turn my heater off. This is the poor shepherd who's about to sell the last of his flock. When I was young, when I was young, a single man, and after youthful follies ran, though little given to care and thought, yet so it was, and ewe I bought, and other sheep from her I raised, as healthy sheep as you might see. And then I married, and was rich as I could wish to be. Of sheep I numbered a full score, and every year increased my store. And it grows, and it grows. His stock grew from year to year, and from this single ewe, full 50 comely sheep I raised. As fine a flock as ever grazed, upon the Cantock hills they fed. They throve, and we at home did thrive. This lusty lamb of all my store is all that is alive, and now I care not if we die, and perish all of poverty. There's a dependence between the domestic felicity and that of the flock. There's this interdependence upon natural life and human life, and really no distinction between the two. But to elevate the voice of this poor shepherd oppressed by poverty and to invest it with the pathos and dignity almost to the point of heroism was something entirely innovative. In fact, it is the level of feeling that elevates, I think, this poem. And that brings us to the third and final important aspect, I think, of the preface. He's prioritizing passion and feeling. And I think, Beth, you mentioned this in your comments in our group chat about this poem. For if the poet's subject be judiciously chosen, it will naturally, and upon fit occasion, lead him to passions, the language of which, if selected truly and judiciously, must necessarily be dignified and variegated, and alive with metaphors and figures. And it's interesting that at the emotional apex of the poem, you get this accumulation of tropes and schemes, what are sometimes just grouped as figures. Look here at this last. This is when he's describing the dwindling of the flock. He had to sell, and the parish won't give him help. Another still, and still another. A little lamb, and then its mother. It was a vein that never stopped. Like blood drops from my heart they dropped. Till 30 were not left alive, they dwindled, dwindled, one by one, and I may say that many a time I wished they all were gone, reckless of what might come at last, were but the bitter struggle past. Notice this first line. We have the scheme of anti-metaboly, where there's a repetition of a phrase, but it's in reverse. Another still, still another. It's the geometric kind of reflection there. A little lamb and then its mother. It was a vein. We have metaphor right here in the third line, which then moves into a simile. Like blood drops from my heart they dropped. Another figure here is going on. It's called polyptoton, which is a rhetorical device that uses the root words again and recreates them in different tenses or in different words. So we have drop here and then dropped as the verb, a modulation there of that word constituting a repetition. And we also just have the repetition of single words, which we remember from our Bible and poetry lectures on Wordsworth's. The thorn is the characteristic of passion in poetry. It's what justifies the repetition of dwindled, dwindled, and one by one. So figurative language coupled with deep feeling. Feeling is the ground of thought for Wordsworth. So the Lyrical Ballads argues, here's one of the great sentences here, it could sum up the whole preface, I think. The language of such poetry as I am recommending is as far as possible a selection of the language really spoken by men. Now, the other way to achieve the revolution of the heart was by teaching their readers how to truly be free, by reconnecting their hearts and minds to the life of nature. And that's what we're going to pick up in the second part of this lecture. This then, as we're moving into the poems for next week, is the quiet revolution of the Lyrical Ballads, not a storming of pastilles, but a recovery of vision, of enchantment even, a political and spiritual intervention disguised in modest verse, wherein birds and lambs, old men and weeping shepherds, wedding guests and solitary wanderers, and children all become participants in the drama of moral and spiritual awakening. Their suffering doesn't cry so much for vengeance, but it pleads for recognition. Their poverty is not staged for spectacle or to play with your feelings, as it has in some previous sentimental verse of the 18th century, but instead the poetry becomes dignified as a mirror of our own inward need. And what liberates them, what frees the readers, if he or she is attentive, is not dogma, but attention. Attention to the still moment, the natural image, the humble word, the quiet feeling. The ability to be stopped, or the willingness to be stopped by someone when you're on your way to a wedding. These poems teach us to pause, to train the eye to become quiet by the power of harmony, into the stillness that allows one to see into the life of things. And it's amazing. We're always the wedding guest. We're always on our way to something really important. And it happens to me. Everything gets swallowed by habitualization, as Shklovsky will say, is that I'll be walking down the road and not even notice the beauty around me because I'm so focused on the wedding, on whatever I'm trying to get to. But the world and its beauty is calling us to stop. So in part 2 of this lecture we'll have next week, we'll turn our attention to specific poems of Coleridge and Wordsworth. We'll now start our post-lecture discussion. So for everyone on YouTube, thanks for watching and for following along, and until next time.